Scrampton, 27 million, scrapped. Linton on News, 2.9 billion, cancelled. And the Rwanda scheme, a shocking £750 million, scrapped. Say that last bit again, sorry. You did do due diligence.
We did do some due diligence. There is more that we could have done, and that is
huge figure. I'm really struggling to match what you're saying with the reality that we see in the information in front of us. Very expensive lesson that we're now learning.
I agree. It's very expensive.
Very expensive indeed. Now this exchange between Labour Party MP Lloyd Hatton, who was asking Sir Matthew Ryecroft, Permanent Secretary for the Home Office, in the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 9th of December 2024. He was asking about what lessons have been learned on housing accommodation for asylum seekers, and what you will hear might just leave you shocked.
I think what's really striking, Sir Matthew, when looking at the NEA report and all of the supplementary documents, is that it feels like the decision to acquire the North Eye site was rushed. Do you agree with that summary, that actually the decision was rushed, and actually the problem is that it was sort of buy first and then do the thinking about how you'd make it work later?
I agree that we were operating at pace. Ministers, I think, were quite within their rights, were pushing us to progress quickly with the acquisition of this site, and indeed of others that we have mentioned. And that was because there was a sense of very high priority for this programme, given the number of people claiming asylum going into the asylum system. And at that stage, there were definitely more people coming into the system than were leaving it. So we needed additional accommodation. Obviously, the first place that we looked for additional accommodation was hotels, but the government had a strategy, as the current government does also, of exiting hotels in time because of the costs of, broadly defined, of having asylum seekers in hotels. And therefore, we had to think laterally and act quickly. But we did do a fair amount of due diligence before the acquisition, which we can go into. But we absolutely, we were seeking to get the balance right between pace on the one hand and full assurance on the other. And the NEA report is very clear that there are lessons to be learned and that there is greater assurance that we should have provided before the acquisition. And that is something that we have learnt and embedded in the future strategy, which I've already mentioned.
So you said about getting the balance right, but surely you would conclude today in front of this committee that you didn't get the balance right. The North Eye site had serious structural problems, including asbestos. The Bibby Stockholm barge was found to have Legionella on board and posed a number of fire risks. So would you conclude that the Home Office at the time of acquiring sites like North Eye, like Bibby Stockholm barge, did not actually get the balance right and corners were cut?
I would say with the benefit of hindsight, we acted with pace, which was what ministers quite rightly were expecting of us. And I accept that there are lessons that we should learn and that we have already learnt from that pace. It is difficult when you're operating in a climate where people think you're not going to act fast enough, and so I think that there was it was only out of good faith and of seeking to do a good job in difficult circumstances that Home Office civil servants rushed to action. I think that there is a difference between the asbestos and other aspects of contamination of this site on the one hand, and the outbreak of disease on the Bibby Stockholm, which was after all the due diligence has been done and was important at the time, but it's not the same sort of scale as the issues of remediation that were required here.
To answer my question, Sir Matthew, did you get the balance right? That was the question. So do you think, looking at the fiasco that's taken place at North Eye, looking at the mess of the Bibby Stockholm barge, was the balance right, yes or no?
With the benefit of hindsight, we should have done more on the assurance side, and if that had cost us a bit of pace, then that would have been a better thing to do, and it's that lesson that we have already learnt. So we will be taking longer to acquire future sites, because we will do more of the due diligence before completing the sale, and that will have a impact in terms of the costs, both the financial cost and the time costs, but that is the lesson that the NAO have quite rightly drawn to our attention and that we have learned from this.
Looking at the North Eye site, though, and many of the other larger schemes and projects that were underway, there does seem to be a pattern which has developed. North Eye cost at least 15.4 million. We now know it was never operational and it's quite likely to be sold. Bibby Stockholm, north of 34 million, going to be closed down in January. Weathersfield, north of 49 million, that's just about hobbling along. Scrampton, 27 million, scrapped. Linton-on-Ouse, 2.9 billion, cancelled. And the Rwanda scheme, a shocking £750 million, scrapped. So would you accept that actually there does seem to have been a cultural problem at the Home Office, which said, purchase, spend all the public money first, release the press release second, and third and final, then do the grown-up thinking about whether or not this was good value for money and is going to deliver what we actually need when it comes to asylum accommodation?
I think that would be an unfair criticism of ministers at the time. I think that they were quite rightly seeking for us to act quickly. With the benefit of hindsight, we should have gone more slowly. We have learnt that lesson, but we did do significant due diligence before the acquisition of all of those sites. One other capability.
Say that last bit again. Sorry, you did do due diligence.
We did do some due diligence. There is more that we could have done, and that is
huge figures: 750 million, 34.8 million, 49 million. These are huge sums of public money. And you're saying you did some due diligence, but here we are, some months later, where almost every one of these schemes is now just about to be scrapped, sold, or wound down. So can you honestly say that diligence was sufficient, considering here we are a few months later saying none of this money's really gone anywhere other than sunk into a load of schemes that are now being wound up because they're not actually doing the job? I just don't understand how you can say that the diligence was actually, pretty much par for the course.
I'm all for learning lessons, but we must learn the right lessons. And the lessons from the Rwanda scheme, which is the largest number that you've described then, are totally different from the lessons from the acquisition of property. And just to remind the committee, I required a ministerial direction on grounds of value for money in relation to the Rwanda scheme. So I think that needs to be
should you have required a direction on the others?
No, because the accounting officer advice at the time was that the value for money test was met, albeit marginally in the case of Bexhill, the one that we're talking about today. The value for money case was actually stronger in relation to the other tests. And again, there is lots of lessons that we are already learning, but I think it would be an unfair characterisation to say that we did no due diligence before the acquisition, no thinking before the acquisition, and then had to do everything afterwards. It was a balance. We will shift the balance further towards even more assurance before acquisition in the future. We have already built up our capability within the team. Belinda has come in as a property professional since March 23, in fact, quite soon after that moment when this acquisition was being finalised.
I'll just one final point, if that's okay, Chair. I'm really struggling to match what you're saying with the reality that we see in the information in front of us, which is that we have huge sums of public money being sunk into these projects, and yet they have almost all had to be abandoned because they are costing the taxpayer a fortune and yet delivering next to nothing. And I don't quite understand how the Permanent Secretary of the Home Office can come before this committee and say we did a bit of diligence, and that's somehow meant to be a sort of boilerplate answer that covers all of this up. Because actually what I'm really concerned is that actually we're not learning the lessons. We've got a pattern here. Huge sums of money go in, the schemes don't work, they get closed down, very little of the money gets clawed back. Just saying we did some diligence right at the start isn't going to cover it.
Well, I just point you to the National Audit Office report. The National Audit Office set out the due diligence that we did do and drew attention to what we didn't do and should have done. We accept absolutely that there was a bit that we didn't do. We didn't do the Red Book valuation, and we do now, as a matter of guarantee, do that in relation to any future site. But we did do a whole series of due diligence before the acquisition of this site, and the National Audit Office set it out, but it included the Green Book valuation, it included the Environment Agency sampling tests, it included a technical due diligence report, it included property control approval request, it included a geo-environmental review, and so on and so forth. All of those things were done in relation to Bexhill. I absolutely accept that there are lessons to be learned, but to swing so far, as your questions are doing, to suggest that we didn't do any due diligence is unfair.
Right. So you think that the current situation basically was unavoidable because enough due diligence was done, or do you think insufficient diligence was done at that early stage, which has led to tens or hundreds of millions of taxpayers' money being spent on a bunch of schemes that are all now being scrapped or closed down?
Clearly, with the benefit of hindsight, there is more due diligence that we could have done, and that's exactly what I just said. That is what we are now doing. That is one of the very precise lessons that we have learnt and we are already applying in relation to future acquisitions. Can I just remind the committee that at the time that we were acquiring these sites, the cost to the taxpayer of hotel accommodation was £8.8 million per night.
I'm aware of that, but these schemes were also found by an NAO report to be even more expensive for the taxpayer. The Bibby Stockholm barge, in a report earlier this year, was found to be a more expensive way of housing asylum seekers than the previous hotels that were used. So I simply don't understand how you can throw that figure and then say, but this was all a solution, when actually these projects are even more expensive and yet don't deliver very much.
I think it's really important to be precise, and the accounting officer advice at the time in relation to each of these sites was that they would be value for money in accordance with the Treasury's rulebook of how to work out value for money. If they had not been, then we either would not have acquired them, or the accounting officer would have required a ministerial direction. That is how these things work, and that is the framework within which we operated. So it's not that the whole framework was wrong, it's just that there is more assurance that we should have done, and we have learnt that lesson, and we are now doing that.
I suppose to conclude, that's the problem, is there was clearly a culture at the time that was very over-optimistic at the outset. And actually, once these things actually started to progress, they realised those overly optimistic assessments made at the outset or during diligence wasn't actually in any way close to reality. And that's a really worrying thing for the committee to hear, that there was a culture which basically said, I think this will be fine, again and again and again. And each time you were proven wrong, and it cost tens, if not hundreds of millions of taxpayers' pounds.
I very much agree that there are lessons we learned, and the optimism bias one, absolutely, that's right. I just
Why
think we need
did
to
you
be
do
very,
it so
very
many times over and over again?
Well, first of all of these acquisitions were happening at the same time. So it's not that we learnt the lessons. It's not that we failed to learn the lessons from Scampton or whatever, and failed to apply them to Bexhill. All of these were happening more or less at the same time, and we have learnt from all of them. We've actually done a lessons learned review, which adds up to a total of over 1,000 lessons that we've learned from the totality of those. And there's a whole programme that Belinda has come in to oversee that is ensuring that we actually learn those lessons that we have now identified. So I just want to be really clear with the committee about what is a reasonable criticism versus criticising the whole thing.
Very expensive lesson that we're now learning.
I agree, it's very expensive. The acquisitions were deemed to be value for money because they would have saved money compared with the counterfactual, which was continuing with hotels at such a high cost. So that is the background, and that is why ministers at the time were so insistent that we operated with pace. And I think that they were absolutely well within their rights to push for that pace.
Yes, very expensive indeed, eh? Northern Eye cost at least £15.4 million. It was never operational and is likely to be sold. The Bibby Stockholm, £34 million, where they cut corners for political cruelty by the sounds of it, is going to be closed down in January. Weatherfield, £49 million, is just about hobbling along, as I say. Scampton, £27 million, scrapped. Linton on Ouse, £2.9 million cancelled, and of course, cannot forget the Rwanda scheme, £715 million scrapped. Conclusive proof that Tories are very good at spending other people's money, aren't they? But what do you guys think? Let me know down below, and if you enjoy everything House of Commons and Select Committee meetings, please like and subscribe, and I shall just bid you farewell and take care, my friends.